14 months after he laughed in a farmer's face, Travis Cole would stand on that same man's land, hat in hand, asking for help he once mocked. But on a bright spring morning in Miller's Ridge, he had no idea that moment was coming. Not when he leaned back against a gleaming green tractor outside the busiest John Deere dealership in 3 counties, flashing the kind of confident smile that only comes from easy commissions and a streak of sales wins that made him the top name on the board for 8 months straight. Not when he spotted Ethan Walker pulling in with a dusty pickup and that same faded red Case IH tractor rattling behind him on a trailer. Not when Travis nudged his coworker and said, "Watch this," before pushing himself off the polished machine and strolling over with the swagger of someone who believed he understood exactly how the world worked. "Ethan, right?" he called out, loud enough for the other farmers browsing the lot to hear. And Ethan, a quiet man in his mid-30s with sunburned skin and steady eyes, nodded as he stepped down from his truck, wiping his hands on his jeans, already knowing where this was going but too polite to stop it. "You still running that old Case IH?" Travis continued, circling the tractor like it was something dragged out of a junkyard, tapping the worn metal with his knuckles. "Man, I thought you were just keeping it for nostalgia." And a couple of younger guys nearby chuckled, shifting their weight as they watched, because Travis had a reputation, not just for selling, but for turning every conversation into a performance. And Ethan glanced at his tractor, then back at Travis, his voice calm, almost too calm. "It still runs every day," he said, and Travis grinned wider, shaking his head like he'd just been handed the perfect setup. "Runs, sure, but for how long? You're farming like it's 1995. Meanwhile, guys your age are upgrading, expanding, actually growing something." He gestured broadly at the lineup of brand new equipment behind him, engines gleaming, paint so green it almost looked artificial under the sun. "This is where the future is," and Ethan followed his gesture, eyes scanning the machines he could technically afford, but wouldn't, not without risking everything. "Future comes with a price," Ethan replied, and Travis laughed, loud and sharp, the kind of laugh meant to carry. "That's the point, man. You invest big, you earn big. That old thing," he pointed again at the Case IH, "that's just holding you back." And for a second, something flickered in Ethan's expression. Not anger, not embarrassment, just a quiet calculation, like he was measuring whether any of this was worth responding to. "I'm not trying to keep up with anyone," he said finally. "Just trying to keep what's mine." And that line didn't land the way Travis expected, because it didn't invite a comeback, didn't give him anything flashy to twist. So he doubled down, stepping closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound personal, but still loud enough for the audience. "Look, I can set you up with financing that makes this easy. Low up front, flexible terms. You walk out of here with something that actually moves your operation forward." And Ethan shook his head slowly. "No loans," he said. Simple as that. And Travis raised an eyebrow, like he'd just heard something absurd. "No loans? Then what are you planning to do when that engine finally gives out in the middle of harvest?" And Ethan met his gaze, steady and unbothered. "Fix it," he said. And a few of the older farmers nearby exchanged glances, because they understood that answer in a way Travis didn't. But Travis just scoffed, throwing his hands up. "You can't fix your way into the future," he said, turning slightly so more people could hear him. "You either scale up or you get left behind." And there it was, the line he'd used on dozens of customers, the line that usually closed deals, the line that made people second-guess themselves just enough to sign on the dotted line. But Ethan didn't bite, didn't argue, didn't defend himself. He just walked back to his truck, checking the straps on the trailer like the conversation had already ended in his mind. "Suit yourself," Travis called after him, a final jab. "But don't say I didn't warn you." And as Ethan drove off, that old red tractor rattling behind him, Travis turned back to the lot, clapping his hands together like he'd just wrapped up another successful pitch. "Some people just don't want to grow," he said to no one in particular, and the day moved on. More customers, more contracts, more signatures stacking up under Travis's name. Farmers walking out with brand new machines and payment plans stretching years into the future, each deal another notch in his belt, another reason to believe he was right about everything. And over the next few weeks, he'd see Ethan around town, at the feed store, at the gas station, always with that same truck, that same tractor, that same quiet demeanor that Travis now treated like a running joke. Still alive?" he'd call out. Or, "That thing hasn't died on you yet?" And Ethan would just nod, maybe give a short answer, never rising to the bait, never playing along, which somehow made Travis push harder, because in his world, confidence was proven by being louder, sharper, more certain than the other guy. And for a while, it worked. Business was booming. The dealership couldn't keep certain models in stock, and Travis's manager started talking about promotions, bigger territories, maybe even a regional role if he kept this up. "You've got the instinct," the manager told him one evening as they looked over the latest numbers. "You know how to get people to move." And Travis believed that completely. Believed that success was just about pushing harder than the next guy, seeing opportunities others were too cautious to take. And every time he thought about Ethan Walker, he saw a man stuck in fear, hiding behind an old machine instead of stepping into something bigger, something better, something that required a little risk, a little faith in the system Travis represented. But what Travis couldn't see, was how thin that system really was, how much it depended on things no one in that dealership could control, not the weather, not the markets, not the fragile balance that kept a farm alive season after season. And as spring turned into early summer, the first heavy rains rolled in over Miller's Ridge, soaking the fields, swelling the rivers, and at first, no one worried. Rain was part of the cycle, something farmers planned around, something that usually passed, but this time, it didn't pass. And somewhere out in those soaked fields, Ethan Walker climbed onto his old Case IH, turned the key, and listened as the engine came to life the same way it always had, steady and reliable. While miles away, Travis Cole stood under the bright lights of the dealership, closing another deal, completely unaware that the choices he'd been so sure about were about to collide with a reality he couldn't sell his way out of. The rain didn't stop, and about 3 weeks after the first storm rolled through Miller's Ridge, Travis Cole began to understand that something was very, very wrong, not in a dramatic, overnight way, but in the slow, creeping kind of way that eats its certainty until there's nothing left but doubt. Because at first it was just delays, farmers calling to push back delivery dates, saying their fields were too saturated, that they needed a little more time before bringing in new equipment. "Give it a week," one of them told Travis over the phone, his voice strained but still hopeful. "Ground just needs to dry out." And Travis, sitting at his desk with a fresh contract laid out in front of him, smiled like it was no big deal. "Of course," he said, "we'll work with you." Because delays didn't scare him. Not when his numbers were still leading the board. Not when management kept reminding everyone that temporary setbacks were part of the business. But then a week turned into 2, and the calls changed, the tone shifting from casual to urgent. "Travis, we might need to restructure that payment plan," another farmer said, his voice tight. "Crop's not looking good." And Travis leaned back in his chair, forcing confidence into his tone. "Let's not panic. We've seen bad patches before." But even as he said it, he pulled up weather reports on his computer, watching the radar paint the same picture day after day. Dark clouds, steady rainfall, no break in sight, and outside the dealership windows, the sky stayed gray, the kind of gray that seemed to press down on everything, turning optimism into something fragile. And by the second month, the situation wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Fields had flooded beyond recovery. Young crops drowned before they could establish roots. And tractors, those shiny, expensive machines Travis had sold with so much pride, sat idle in barns or on muddy edges of land that couldn't support their weight, becoming symbols of something no one wanted to admit. That growth had come at a cost far heavier than expected. And then came the first missed payment. Travis remembered it clearly because it was from one of his biggest deals. A farmer named Dale who had signed for 2 top-of-the-line units and a full package of add-ons. "I'm not going to make it this month," Dale said bluntly over the phone. No excuses, no small talk, just the truth. And Travis felt a flicker of irritation before he masked it, because missed payments meant paperwork, meant conversations with management, meant cracks in the perfect record he'd built. "We can figure something out," Travis replied. But this time, he didn't sound as certain. And as days passed, 1 missed payment became 3, then 5, then more than he could keep track of without opening spreadsheets that now looked less like achievements and more like liabilities. And the dealership changed too. The energy shifting from fast-paced excitement to quiet tension, conversations lowering in volume, laughter disappearing entirely, and Travis's manager, once full of praise, started closing his office door more often, calling in salespeople one by one, the kind of meetings that didn't need explanation. And still, Travis told himself it would pass, that the system would hold, that farmers would recover like they always had, because that belief was the foundation of everything he'd said, everything he'd sold. But then repossession started, not all at once, but enough to be noticed. Trucks rolling out to collect equipment that had barely seen a full season of work, machines Travis himself had delivered with a handshake and a confident smile, now being taken back in silence, sometimes with the farmer standing nearby, arms crossed, watching years of hope get loaded onto a trailer. And Travis avoided those scenes at first, telling himself it wasn't his job to handle collections, that he was there to sell, not to deal with fallout. But one afternoon, he didn't have a choice. He drove out to a property on the edge of town, paperwork in hand, expecting a routine conversation. But what he found instead was a man sitting on his porch, staring out at a field that had turned into a shallow lake, the tractor parked uselessly near the waterline. "You here to take it?" the farmer asked without looking at him, and Travis hesitated, something unfamiliar tightening in his chest. "I'm here to talk," he said. But even he knew how hollow that sounded, and the man finally looked at him, eyes tired, voice steady in a way that cut deeper than anger. "You told me this would change everything," he said, and Travis opened his mouth, ready with the same lines he'd used 100 times, about opportunity, about long-term gains. But nothing came out, because standing there, with the smell of wet earth and loss hanging in the air, those words didn't fit anymore. And for the first time, Travis felt it. Not just doubt, but responsibility, a quiet, heavy realization that he had pushed people toward decisions that made sense on paper but didn't survive reality. And that night, he drove home in silence, passing farm after farm, each one telling a different version of the same story. Fields struggling, equipment unused, lights off earlier than usual, like the entire town was holding its breath. And somewhere along that drive, he found himself turning down a familiar road without really thinking about it, slowing as he approached Ethan Walker's land. And what he saw there didn't make sense at first, because while everything else looked worn down by the weather, Ethan's fields, though far from perfect, were still intact, rows uneven but alive, patches of green pushing through where others had failed. And in the middle of it all, that same old Case IH tractor moved steadily, not fast, not flashy, just consistent, cutting through the damp soil like it had done 1,000 times before. And Travis pulled over, engine idling, watching in silence as Ethan worked. No rush, no panic, just focus. And it hit him then, harder than any missed payment or tense phone call, that Ethan hadn't been left behind. He had simply refused to gamble everything on a system that assumed things would go right. And while everyone else had built their season on borrowed momentum, Ethan had built his on control, on limits, on knowing exactly what he could afford to lose, and refusing to lose more than that. And as Travis sat there, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than necessary, the memory of his own voice echoed back at him, loud and confident. "You either scale up or you get left behind." And for the first time, he questioned it, not as a passing thought, but as something fundamentally flawed, because out in that field, under a sky that still threatened more rain, the man he had mocked for thinking small was the one still standing. And the man who had pushed everyone to think bigger was beginning to realize that bigger didn't always mean stronger. It just meant there was more to lose. 14 months later, the road back to Ethan Walker's farm felt longer than it had any right to be. And Travis Cole gripped the steering wheel of his old pickup, a far cry from the brand new truck he used to drive, trying to steady the mix of nerves and humility that sat heavy in his chest. Because everything had changed since that season of endless rain, not all at once, but piece by piece, like something slowly unraveling until there was nothing left to hold on to. The dealership had downsized. After months of declining sales and rising defaults, half the staff let go in a single meeting that felt more like a quiet surrender than a business decision. And Travis, once their top performer, had been among them, not because he stopped knowing how to sell, but because there was no one left willing or able to buy, not on the terms he had once pushed so confidently. And in the months that followed, he tried to stay in the same line of work, bounced between smaller dealerships, even considered switching industries altogether. But his reputation followed him. Whispers from farmers who remembered his promises, his pressure, the way he made growth sound like the only option. And slowly, doors stopped opening, calls stopped coming back, and the certainty that had once defined him was replaced by something quieter, heavier, harder to ignore. Understanding. The kind that comes too late to prevent mistakes, but just in time to make you see them clearly. And through it all, one image kept returning to him, uninvited and persistent. Ethan Walker, standing beside that old Case IH tractor, calm in the face of everything Travis had thrown at him. A man who hadn't needed to prove anything because he already knew where he stood. And that image stayed with Travis until one morning. After another sleepless night and another look at bills that didn't care about pride, he made a decision that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. He got in his truck, drove out past the edge of town, and turned onto the same gravel road he had once driven down with confidence. And as the farm came into view, it looked much the same as it had before, not untouched by hardship, but steady, grounded, alive in a way that couldn't be faked. And there, moving slowly across the field, was that same red tractor, its paint still faded, its engine still reliable, and Travis parked near the fence, sitting for a moment as he watched, gathering the courage to step out, because this wasn't just a visit, it was an admission. And when he finally opened the door and walked across the dirt, the sound of his boots felt louder than it should have, like every step was announcing the weight of why he was there. "Ethan," he called out, his voice carrying just enough to reach over the hum of the engine. And Ethan looked up, cutting the tractor and climbing down with the same unhurried movements Travis remembered, his expression neutral, not surprised, not welcoming, just aware. And for a few seconds, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between past and present, between who Travis had been and who he was standing there as now. And then Travis did something he had never done before, not in business, not in life. He dropped the performance completely. "I owe you an apology," he said, the words plain, unpolished, real, and Ethan didn't respond right away, didn't interrupt, just watched him, waiting to see if there was more. And there was, because once Travis started, he couldn't pretend anymore. "I thought I had everything figured out," he continued, his voice steady but quieter than it used to be. "I pushed people into decisions they weren't ready for. I told them bigger was better, that risk was the only way forward. And when you didn't go along with it," he paused, glancing briefly at the tractor beside them, "I mocked you for it." And Ethan's gaze shifted for a moment, not defensive, not vindictive, just taking it in. "You weren't wrong to question me," Travis added, almost as if he needed to say it out loud, to believe it himself. "I just didn't want to hear it." And the wind moved lightly across the field, carrying the kind of quiet that only exists in places built on patience. And finally, Ethan spoke, his voice as even as it had always been. "So why are you here?" And there it was, the question that mattered, not about the past, not about the apology, but about the reason standing in front of him now. And Travis didn't hesitate this time, because honesty was the only thing he had left to offer. "I need help," he said, and the words hung in the air, heavier than anything he had ever said in a sales pitch, heavier than any contract he had ever signed, because this wasn't about convincing someone else. It was about admitting where he stood. And Ethan studied him for a moment, not looking for weakness, not judging, just measuring the truth of it. And Travis met his gaze without looking away, because there was nothing left to hide behind. No numbers, no strategy, no polished confidence, just a man who had finally understood the cost of being wrong. And after a long second, Ethan glanced back at the fields, then at the tractor, then at Travis again. "You willing to learn?" he asked. And the simplicity of the question caught Travis off guard, because it didn't come with conditions, didn't reopen old wounds, didn't demand anything except something he had spent most of his life avoiding. And he nodded, once, firm and certain in a way that felt different from before. "Yeah," he said, "I am." And Ethan gave a small nod in return, like that was enough for now. "Sunrise," he said, turning back toward the tractor. "That's when we start." And there was no handshake. No dramatic closure, just an opportunity, plain and straightforward. And as Ethan climbed back up and restarted the engine, Travis stepped back, watching as the machine moved forward again, steady as ever. And for the first time since everything had fallen apart, He didn't feel like he was chasing something he didn't understand. He felt like he was standing at the beginning of something real, something built not on pressure or promises, but on work, patience, and a respect he had once mistaken for weakness. And as he walked back to his truck, the memory of that day at the dealership, the laughter, the mocking, the certainty, felt distant, not erased, but reshaped into something he could finally learn from. Because sometimes it takes losing the life you thought you wanted to understand the one you should have been building all along.